A number of years ago, I posited the question, when does a submodality become content, and when does content become a submodality? This is one of those things I like to torment the NLPers with. The left hemisphere of the brain is the very logical, content-orientated hemisphere. The right hemisphere is very much the abstraction, submodality, and emotional side. So we have digital on one side and a logical processing on the other. Now, this is something that a lot of people disagree with because they go, well, the brain works as an integrated whole, blah, 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 blah. And there's lots of models in neurology that will basically support that. And that's absolutely the case. Of course, the brain works as an integrated whole. But there is a hemispheric asymmetry in terms of the overall function. And with recent publications, things like The Master and His Emissary, a book so big you can use it as a doorstop, it's back in fashion again to actually start thinking about asymmetric function of the two hemispheres. So one of the examples I give is we have a completely white room full of white furniture with bright white lights. Make a picture of that in your imagination. Now, keeping the content exactly the same, turn the submodalities all the way down to make it really dark. At what point does the submodality change become the content and vice versa? Now, of course, these aren't really that sort of dichotomous in it's one or the other. These things exist on a spectrum. The fact that we have the asymmetric function of the brain allows us to coherently process both things simultaneously. So it creates a bit of an illusion. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a second that each hemisphere is completely divided between submodalities and content. That's undoubtedly not how it works. There's going to be huge areas of overlap, but there's going to be a very strong bias between the two hemispheres. Well, I mean, each hemisphere has its own bias, that's what I mean. So now, with all that in mind, this now brings up the question that I received this week, and it was quite a complex question, really, and I thought it's worthy of a video rather than me try and reply to it by email, because I'd be there all day trying to write the answer. So let me just pull up the question, and I'll read it to you. Okay, so I'm watching some of your videos. There is something I can't figure out about immersion metaphors. Now, for those unfamiliar, immersion metaphors are basically when you're immersed in a liquid. This is something that I teach in much more detail in the level 3 of the training. For those who've not done level 3 but want to do it, I'm teaching it later this year. It's going to be live and online. It's over divided sessions. If you go to metaphorestraining.com, that's metaphorestraining.com, you'll find the details on there. And just while I'm doing the sales pitch, there is a installment plan for those who want to pay over 12 months. Right, so if boundaried immersions, so essentially a boundary immersion is where you're in a container of liquid as opposed to an infinite ocean. So you have boundaried immersions or unboundaried. Boundary is when you're in like a swimming pool, in a pond, in a lake, that kind of stuff. So it doesn't go on infinitely in all directions. But the boundaries have the borders that are really far away. Is it still a container? So do I grow up? And if so, why? There's a big space around to move, and though there'll be a lot of manual work. And this is one of these problems. So if I'm in a swimming pool that is very small, it's one of these immersion tubs, these ice bucket things that people sit themselves in the belief it's going to enhance their life. Anyway, imagine I'm sitting in one of those. I'm immersed. I might be immersed up to my chin. Bit chilly. And I've got a very tight boundary around me. That's a very obvious container. And that will also tell you some information about the person's childhood. A very cold environment, and that's probably metaphorically cold as opposed to literally cold. So be an emotionally cold environment in which the person grew up. Got to be honest, I've never had anyone report one of those. Now, we extend that boundary out, say, to 20 feet away. Okay, so it's still a container, still very obviously a container, but the person in that cold environment has a lot more room to move. Now, escape from that is possible. It just means they've got to make a bit of effort to get to the edge. Now, if we extend that out by a mile in each direction, we now still have a boundaried container, but there's a lot more room to move. And we can now just keep extending that out infinitely. The question here is, when does the boundary cease to become relevant? And is there a threshold? There probably isn't. However, I would suggest an immediate obvious threshold when you see enough containers is fingertip distance apart. Now you can probably hear the workmen outside doing the whatever they're doing. Local council, they make the little job out there last all bloody day. So I've given up waiting for them to go away. It's hopeless. They stop and they start, they stop and they stop. So now we have the question of how much space do we require before it's no longer a boundary, it's no longer a container. And then for the differentiation, how close does the barrier need to be before we grow up, as opposed to do the other processes that get taught on level 3. Not going to go into all of that here, because then I might as well just do all the training here, and I'll be here for literally 3 days. So not going to do that. And this is a problem, and I don't have an answer to it. It's a similar thing to a tunnel. So if I'm in a tunnel, and actually the tunnel only has one opening in front of me, I'm in a tunnel with my back to the back wall, and the tunnel extends in front. That's a container. But now if we now move that thing behind me all the way out, and actually I'm in an infinite tunnel, but it's got an exit at each end, if that's even possible, with an infinite tunnel, that's not a container. So again, we're into this area of overlap where we have to now start to use knowledge of the world. But there's something else here as well. The container metaphors represent largely, it's not exclusively, largely family. It's the circumstances into which we're born, hence why it's family, and the circumstances into which we grow up. And then we have to learn to grow out of if they're problematic to us. Remember, not all containers are problematic to the individual. Some people like them. I know this comes as a shock, they actually like their families. So they don't necessarily need to grow up out of that. And these are the unique circumstances that affect every individual uniquely. What we have, though, is that container exists within a context. And that context is greater society. Other factors that are both acting upon the family and indirectly acting upon the individual. And indeed, that set of contexts are inside another context in itself, all the way out to get to the context that we're on a big spinning rock that's whizzing round at 66,000 miles an hour, moving around the sun. And then you can take that context out even further, that the sun itself is moving around in the galaxy and so forth. So essentially, everything that exists within a context. And that context exists within a greater context and so forth. It just comes down to, how do we divide it? Because if my family exists within a context, where am I putting the boundary between the context and the family? Because there's all so many factors. It depends where we put the cookie cutter in, if that's the right expression, to actually divide things out. So a lot of it is how we organize and sort the information in our own experience to reveal those things. And we're going to have to basically use a judgment call when it comes to boundaried immersions. Now, realistically, if I've got a person in a swimming pool and they're sort of drowning, they're going under and all the rest of it, what we know is this is a readily escapable situation. And it may well be a recurring theme in their life because it's a container. Therefore, it might be time to grow up and grow out of that one and stop doing that. I've never had one where the boundary is so great it becomes a judgment call. However, if we're now into the situation that survival is unlikely, survival within that liquid is unlikely, then we're going to use the immersion protocol to deal with that. Essentially, I define immersion metaphors that I treat as immersions, where the person is the anomaly to the environment and escape is unlikely or impossible. So there's a lot more in that I cover in the level 3 work. Now, there's a part 2 to this question. What does it actually mean that the consequence of being the anomaly in the environment is this? The person can't live in an infinite ocean. They're not a fish. They're not a dolphin. They're not going to do that. They're the anomaly. The environment will change them. The environment will change them. Most of the time, there's a combination, there's a feedback process between us changing our environment and changing the circumstances around us versus adaptation to it. So what we have to start to look at is at what level is adaptation just not possible, is not feasible. A person in a infinite ocean cannot adapt to that. They can't. It's not feasible. Therefore, they are the anomaly within the environment. If we consider a dry immersion, so the infinite desert, The person cannot survive that. They are the anomaly within that. We didn't evolve to live in the middle of infinite deserts nor infinite oceans. And so they will be changed by the environment, whether they like it or not. And that will basically be entirely maladaptive. And so what we're looking is at adaptation versus maladaptation, and what is possible there. And often when adaptation is not possible, the person needs to make some really, really fundamental changes in their life. So I think that's what I want to go into with this particular question. It's a great question. But as I say, metaphorstraining.com, do have a look. I'm going to be putting up more dates actually in the next week or so for future events as well. So do check that out.